Today I'm going to be reflecting on the articles I read this week and the videos. And to start out, I want to talk about the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. This was signed between the American president and the Mexican president in order to facilitate trade between the countries. And this definitely wasn't free trade. It did not work that well. What happened is it actually drove Mexico into the tortilla crisis. And this was when corn was being almost stockpiled by U.S. companies that were almost forming a corn monopoly. And what it was supposed to do was provide jobs in Mexico and have them be able to trade equally with the U.S. and other countries, when in reality what happened is farmers lost their jobs in Mexico because of the corporations taking over. Workers were not able to work there, so they were forced to try and immigrate to the United States to find work, which that's just almost a human rights violation because they're not choosing to immigrate. They're having no choice but to move from Mexico to the United States to find work to provide for their families. And what actually happened is then Americans and corporations started complaining that was so much immigration to the United States, when in reality they just weren't paying those workers. They didn't pay penalties for what they did to them. Honestly, they got off easy. It was very horrible what happened in Mexico, and it depleted the Mexican economy when it was actually supposed to benefit them. Now, leading into how American corporations commit human rights violations, I also want to talk about the other article and then tie it into the video also. Because what we saw a lot happening was extractivism through mining, finding oil down there, gold, silver. All these companies were coming from well-established first world countries, then going to the Latin American countries and drilling and forming factories down there, creating lots of pollution and pollution in their water. And they paid workers that worked at those factories in those mines pennies on the dollar in reality. I mean, they could barely afford food for their family, barely afford water. They could not even put a floor on the ground of their home. They were literally living in a dirt floor home. And when they would go to work, they'd be in horrible conditions. In the factories, they'd be exposed to lead. They were getting lead poisoning. You see the spots all over their arms in the videos, on their face. When they would come home, they had to be careful. When they were around their children, they made sure they had to wash off before they exposed their children to lead poisoning. Their kids were in such horrible conditions because they couldn't afford to live in just a decent home, not even nice homes, that when their kids were playing soccer, a lot of times the ball would roll in their sewage because they didn't have sewage systems. And then the kids would touch their face. Lots of infections were going around the community because they lived so close together in such tight spaces. Yet corporations did not care what these families were going through and how poor of conditions they were living in. Also, a lot of times what I would see in the video and I read is that these corporations just didn't want to pay these workers any, even when they fired them, their last paycheck. They would barely give it to them. They didn't want to because they believed they were almost less than them, and they wanted them to work for pennies on the dollar. And when they tried to get more pay, the companies moved to Asia to get cheaper work because they knew they could get cheaper work there. And that's all they were looking for. They would barely give them human rights for their work that they did at the companies in the factories. Even when they were exposed to lead through gaseous pollution, these companies were harming not only their water systems, but also the ecosystem in general and the ozone. And they just didn't care. They had no knowledge that they knew what they were doing, but they did not care that they were harming that ecosystem around it because they didn't live there. They didn't see that. They lived in their nice $1 million homes in America, and it just wasn't affecting them. Their paychecks were just bigger because of it. And through all this that I watched, and I really learned a lot about these sweatshops, basically, is that no matter how hard they worked, it was almost impossible even to rise up through the ranks and better their families and better their opportunities. They were just forced to make bottom dollar to stay alive. And this was just a horrible way to live. It is a horrible way to live still that it happens. And it's just, it really opened my eyes up to how much that American corporations just don't almost care about the human rights of others in other countries.